Hey Wow TV fam. I just wanted to quickly thank you for being here. Crafting these videos takes time, and if you enjoy what you see, a like goes a long way. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our content and help our community grow. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment with any suggestions or feedback. Alright, let's dive into today's video. Peter Curtin was born into a deprived, abusive family in Mulheim am Rhein on May 26, 1883, the oldest of 13 children. Curtin's parents were both alcoholics who lived in a one-bedroom apartment, and Curtin's father frequently beat his wife and children, particularly when he was drunk. When intoxicated, Curtin's father often forced his wife and children to assemble before him before ordering his wife to strip naked and have sex with him as his children watched. He was jailed for 18 months in 1897 for repeatedly raping his eldest daughter, who was aged 13. Shortly thereafter, Curtin's mother obtained a separation order, and later remarried and relocated to Düsseldorf. In 1888, Curtin attempted to drown one of his playmates and, for years later, befriended a local dog catcher who lived in the same building as his family. He began accompanying the dog catcher on his rounds, and this individual often tortured and killed the animals he caught. Curtin soon became an active and willing participant in torturing the animals. As the eldest surviving son, Curtin was the target of much of his father's physical abuse, leading him to frequently refuse to return home from school. Despite being a good student, he later recollected that his academic performance suffered due to the extensive physical violence he endured. From an early age, Curtin often ran away from home for periods ranging from days to weeks, spending much of that time in the company of petty criminals and social misfits. Through these acquaintances, he was introduced to various forms of petty crime, initially committing them as a means of self-sustenance while living on the streets. Curtin later claimed to have committed his first murders at the age of 9 when he pushed a school friend, who couldn't swim, off a log raft. When a second boy attempted to save the drowning youngster, Curtin held his head under the water, causing both boys to drown. Authorities ruled both deaths as accidental. At the age of 13, Curtin formed a relationship with a girl his age and, although she allowed Curtin to undress and touch her, she would resist any attempts he made to engage in intercourse. To relieve his sexual urges, Curtin resorted to acts of zoophilia and later claimed he obtained his greatest sense of elation if he stabbed these animals just before his achieving orgasm. Thus, he began stabbing and slashing animals with increasing frequency to achieve orgasms, although he was adamant this behavior ended when he was observed stabbing a pig. He also attempted to rape the same sister his father had earlier molested. In 1897, Curtin left school. At his father's insistence, he obtained employment as an apprentice molder. This training lasted for 2 years before Curtin stole all the money he could find in his household, plus approximately 300 marks from his employer, and ran away from home. He relocated to Koblenz, where he began a brief relationship with a prostitute 2 years his senior who, he claimed, willingly submitted to every form of sexual perversion he demanded of her. He was apprehended just 4 weeks later and charged with both breaking and theft and subsequently sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment. He was released from prison in August 1899 and reverted to the life of petty crime he had lived before his arrest. Curtin asserted that he committed his first murder in November 1899. In his 1930 confessions to investigators, Curtin recounted picking up an 18-year-old girl at the Allee-Strasse and convincing her to accompany him to the Hofgarten. He claimed to have engaged in sex with the girl before strangling her into unconsciousness with his bare hands and leaving the scene, believing her to be dead. No contemporaneous records exist to corroborate Curtin's claims, and if this attack did occur, the victim likely survived. Nevertheless, Curtin later declared that through this act, he had proven to himself that the greatest heights of sexual ecstasy could only be achieved in this manner. Shortly thereafter, around 1900, Curtin faced arrest for fraud. Later in the same year, he was rearrested on the same charge, with additional accusations related to his 1899 Düsseldorf thefts and the attempted murder of a girl with a firearm. Consequently, Curtin received a 4-year imprisonment sentence in October 1900, serving his time in Derendorf, a borough of Düsseldorf. Released in the summer of 1904, Curtin was conscripted into the Imperial German Army and deployed to Metz and Lorraine to serve in the 98th Infantry Regiment. However, he soon deserted. In the following autumn, Curtin initiated a series of arsons, discreetly observing from a distance as emergency services worked to extinguish the fires. Most of these incidents occurred in barns and haylofts, with Curtin admitting to around 24 acts of arson upon his arrest that New Year's Eve. He freely acknowledged committing these fires for both sexual excitement and the hope of burning sleeping tramps alive. Due to his desertion, Curtin faced a military court trial, where he was convicted of desertion, multiple counts of arson, robbery, and attempted robbery, pertaining to acts committed that year. He was imprisoned from 1905 to 1913 in Munster, spending much of his time in solitary confinement for repeated instances of insubordination. Curtin later told investigators and psychologists that this period of incarceration marked his first encounter with severe forms of discipline. Consequently, the erotic fantasies he had developed earlier in Düsseldorf expanded to include graphic visions of striking out at society and killing masses of people. These fantasies became increasingly dominant in his mind, and Curtin claimed to derive a peculiar pleasure from these visions, comparable to what others might experience when thinking about a naked woman. He added that he occasionally experienced spontaneous ejaculations while preoccupied with such thoughts. The first murder Curtin committed occurred on May 25, 1913. During a burglary at a tavern in Mulheim am Rhein, he encountered a 9-year-old girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Curtin strangled the child, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife, emitting as he heard the blood dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. The following day, Curtin specifically returned to Köln to drink in a tavern located directly opposite that in which he had murdered Klein so that he could listen to the locals' reactions to the child's murder. He later recollected to investigators that he derived an extreme sense of gratification from the general disgust, repulsion, and outrage he had heard in the patrons' conversations. Moreover, in the weeks following Klein's funeral, Curtin occasionally traveled to Mulheim am Rhein to visit the child's grave, adding that when he handled the soil covering the grave, he spontaneously ejaculated. 2 months later, again in the course of committing a burglary with the aid of a skeleton key, Curtin broke into a home in Düsseldorf. Discovering a 17-year-old girl named Gertrude Franken asleep in her bed, Curtin manually strangled the girl, ejaculating at the sight of blood spouting from her mouth, before leaving the crime scene. Curtin managed to escape from the scene of this attempted murder and the earlier murder of Klein undetected. Just days after the attempted murder of Franken, on July 14, Curtin faced arrest for a series of arson attacks and burglaries. He received a 6-year imprisonment sentence. However, his repeated instances of insubordination during imprisonment led to an extension of his incarceration by a further 2 years. Curtin served this sentence in a military prison in the town of Brieg, then part of the German Empire. Released in April 1921, Curtin moved to Altenburg, initially residing with his sister. Through her, Curtin became acquainted with Auguste Scharf, a woman 3 years his senior, a sweet shop proprietor, and former prostitute previously convicted of shooting her fiancé to death. Initially posing as a former prisoner of war, Curtin and Scharf married 2 years later. Despite regular sexual engagement between the couple, Curtin later admitted that he could consummate his marriage only by fantasizing about committing violence against another individual. After their wedding night, he engaged in intercourse with his wife only at her invitation. For the first time in his life, Curtin secured regular employment and became an active trades union official. However, aside from his wife, he formed no close friendships. In 1925, he returned with Scharf to Düsseldorf, where he initiated affairs with a servant girl named Tita and a housemaid named Mek. Both women were frequently subjected to partial strangulation during intercourse, with Curtin once telling Tita, "That's what love means." When his wife discovered his infidelity, Tita reported Curtin to the police, claiming he had seduced her, while Mek alleged Curtin had raped her. The more serious charge was later dropped, but Tita's allegations were pursued, resulting in Curtin receiving an 8-month prison sentence for seduction and threatening behavior. He served 6 months of this sentence, and his early release was conditional on leaving Düsseldorf. He later successfully appealed the ruling that required him to relocate from the city. On February 3, 1929, Curtin stalked a middle-aged woman named Apollonia Kuhn. Waiting until Kuhn was shielded from the view of possible witnesses by bushes, Curtin pounced upon her, holding her by the lapels of her coat and yelling the words, "No row! Don't scream," before dragging her into nearby undergrowth, where he proceeded to stab her 24 times with a sharpened pair of scissors. Although many of the blows were inflicted so deeply that the scissors struck her bones, Kuhn survived her injuries. On February 8, Curtin strangled a 9-year-old girl named Rosa Olliger into unconsciousness before stabbing her in the stomach, temple, genitals and heart with a pair of scissors, spontaneously ejaculating as he knifed the child. He then inserted his semen into her vagina with his fingers. Curtin then made a rudimentary effort to hide Olliger's body by dragging it beneath a hedge before returning to the scene with a bottle of kerosene several hours later and setting the child's body alight, achieving an orgasm at the sight of the flames. Olliger's body was found beneath a hedge the following day. 5 days later, on February 13, Curtin murdered a 45-year-old mechanic named Rudolf Scheer in the suburb of Flingen Nord, stabbing him 20 times, particularly about the head, back and eyes. Following the discovery of Scheer's body, Curtin returned to the scene of the murder to converse with police, falsely informing one detective he had heard about the murder via telephone. Despite the differences in age and sex of these 3 victims, the fact that all 3 crimes had been committed in the Flingern district of Düsseldorf at dusk, that each victim had received a multitude of stab wounds likely inflicted in rapid succession and invariably involving at least one wound to the temple, plus the absence of a common motive such as robbery, led investigators to conclude the same perpetrator had committed all 3 attacks. Furthermore, the seemingly random selection of these victims led criminologists to remark as to the abnormal nature of the perpetrator. Although Curtin did attempt to strangle 4 women between March and July 1929, one of whom he claimed to have thrown into the Rhine River, he is not known to have killed any further victims until August 11 when he raped, strangled, then repeatedly stabbed a young woman named Maria Hahn. Curtin had first encountered Hahn, whom he described as a girl looking for marriage, on August 8, and had arranged to take her on a date to the Neanderthal district of Düsseldorf the following Sunday. After several hours in Hahn's company, Curtin lured her into a meadow in order that he could kill her. He later admitted Hahn had repeatedly pleaded with him to spare her life as he alternately strangled her, stabbed her in the chest and head, or sat astride her body, waiting for her to die. Hahn died approximately 1 hour after Curtin had begun attacking her. Fearful his wife might connect the bloodstains she had noted on his clothes with Hahn's murder, Curtin later buried her body in a cornfield, only to return to her body several weeks later with the intention of nailing her decomposing remains to a tree in a mock crucifixion to shock and disgust the public. However, Hahn's remains proved too heavy for Curtin to complete this act, and he simply returned her corpse to her grave before embracing and caressing the decomposing body as he lay beneath her remains. He then reburied Hahn's body. According to Curtin's later confession, both before and after he had attempted to impale Hahn's corpse to a tree, he went to the grave many times and kept improving on it, and every time I thought of what was lying there and was filled with satisfaction. 3 months after Curtin had murdered Hahn, he posted an anonymous letter to the police in which he confessed to the murder, adding that her remains had been buried in a field. In this letter, Curtin also drew a crude map describing the location of the remains. This letter would prove sufficiently detailed to enable investigators to locate Hahn's remains on November 15. Following the Hahn murder, Curtin changed his choice of weapon from scissors to a knife in an apparent effort to convince police more than one perpetrator was responsible for the unfolding crime spree. In the early morning of August 21, he randomly stabbed an 18-year-old girl, a 30-year-old man, and a 37-year-old woman in separate attacks. All 3 were seriously wounded, and all stated to police their assailant had not spoken a word to them before he had attacked them. 3 days later, at a fairground in the suburb of Flea, Curtin observed 2 foster sisters, aged 5 and 14, walking from the fairground, through adjoining allotments, en route to their home. Sending the older girl, Louise Lenzen, on an errand to purchase cigarettes for him upon the promise of being given 20 pfennig, Curtin lifted the younger child, Gertrude Hamaker, off the ground by her neck and strangled her into unconsciousness before cutting her throat and discarding her body in a patch of runner beans. When Lenzen returned to the scene, Curtin partially strangled her before stabbing her about the torso, with one wound piercing her aorta. He also bit and twice cut her throat before sucking blood from the wounds. Neither girl had been sexually assaulted, and the fact only Lenzen's footprints were found within 7 meters of her body suggests she may have attempted to flee from her attacker before collapsing. The following day, Curtin accosted a 27-year-old housemaid named Gertrude Schult, whom he openly asked to engage in sex with him. Upon being rebuffed, Curtin shouted, "Well, die then," before repeatedly stabbing the woman in the head, neck, shoulder, and back. Schult survived her injuries, although she was unable to provide investigators with a clear description of her assailant, beyond assuming his age to be around 40. Curtin tried to murder 2 additional victims, one by strangulation, another by stabbing, in September, before opting to predominantly use a hammer in his murders. On the evening of September 30th, Curtin encountered a 31-year-old servant girl named Ida Reuter at Düsseldorf station. He successfully convinced Reuter to accompany him to a cafe, and then for a walk through the local Hofgarten close to the Rhine River. At this location, he repeatedly struck her about the head with a hammer both before and after he had raped her. At one stage in this assault, Reuter regained consciousness and began pleading with Curtin to spare her life. In response, Curtin simply gave her other hammer blows on the head and misused her. 11 days later, on October 11th, he met a 22-year-old servant girl named Elizabeth Dorier outside a theater. As had been the case with Reuter, Dorier consented to accompany Curtin for a drink at a cafe before the pair took a train to Grafenberg, to walk alongside the Klein-Dussel River. Here she was struck once across her right temple with a hammer, then raped. Curtin struck her repeatedly about the head and both temples with his hammer and left her for dead. Dorier was found in a coma at 6:30 a.m. the following morning. She died from her injuries the following day. On October 25th, Curtin attacked 2 women with a hammer. Both survived, although in the second instance, this may have been because Curtin's hammer broke in the attack. On November 7, 1929, Curtin encountered a 5-year-old girl named Gertrude Albermann in the Flingern district of Düsseldorf. He convinced the child to accompany him to a section of deserted allotments, where he grabbed her by the throat and strangled her, stabbing her once in the left temple with a pair of scissors as per his modus operandi. When Albermann collapsed to the ground without a sound, Curtin stabbed the child 34 additional times in the temple and chest before putting her body in a pile of nettles close to a factory wall. By the late summer of 1929, the murders committed by the individual known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf garnered considerable national and international attention. The sheer savagery of the murders, the diverse backgrounds of the victims, and the differing methods in which they had been assaulted and/or murdered led both the police and the press to theorize that the spate of assaults and murders were the work of more than one perpetrator. By the end of 1929, Düsseldorf police had received more than 13,000 letters from the public. With assistance from surrounding police forces, each lead was painstakingly pursued. As a result of this collective investigation into the killings, more than 9,000 individuals were interviewed, 2,650 other clues were painstakingly pursued, and a list of 900,000 different names was compiled upon an official potential suspect list. 2 days after the murder of Gertrude Albermann, a local communist newspaper received a map revealing the location of the grave of Maria Hahn. In this drawing, Curtin also disclosed precisely where he had left Albermann's body, which had been found earlier that day, describing the exact position of her corpse, which he stated could be found face down among bricks and rubble. An analysis of the handwriting revealed the author was the same individual who had anonymously informed police in a letter dated October 14 that he had killed Hahn and buried her body at the edge of the woods. Each of the 3 letters Curtin had thus far sent to newspapers and police describing his exploits and threatening further assaults and murders were examined by a graphologist who confirmed the same individual had written each letter, thus leading Ernst Jennat, chief inspector of the Berlin police, to conclude that one man was responsible for most or all of the spate of assaults and murders. The murder of Gertrude Albermann marked Curtin's final fatal attack, although he did engage in a spate of non-fatal hammer attacks and attempted strangulations between February and May 1930, maiming 10 victims in these assaults. All the victims survived, and many were able to describe their attacker to the police. On May 14, 1930, an unknown man approached a 20-year-old woman named Maria Budlik at Düsseldorf station. Discovering Budlik had traveled to Düsseldorf from Köln in search of lodgings and employment, he offered to direct her towards a local hostel. Budlik agreed to follow the man, although she became apprehensive when he attempted to lead her through a scarcely populated park. The pair began to argue, whereupon another man approached the two, asking whether Budlik was being pestered by her companion. When Budlik nodded, the man with whom she had been arguing simply walked away. The identity of the man who reportedly came to Budlik's aid was Peter Curtin. Curtin invited the distressed young woman to his apartment on Mettmannerstrasse to eat and drink before Budlik, correctly deducing the underlying motive for Curtin's hospitality, stated she was uninterested in engaging in sex with him. Curtin calmly agreed and offered to lead Budlik to a hotel, although he instead lured her into the Grafenberg woods, where he seized her by the throat and attempted to strangle her as he raped her. When Budlik began to scream, Curtin released his grasp on her throat before allowing her to leave. Budlik did not report this assault to the police but described her ordeal in a letter to a friend, although she addressed the letter incorrectly. As such, the letter was opened at the post office by a clerk on May 19. Upon reading the contents of the letter, this clerk forwarded the letter to the Düsseldorf police. Chief Inspector Jennat, who assumed there was a slim chance Budlik's assailant might be the Düsseldorf murderer, read this letter. Jennat interviewed Budlik, who recounted her ordeal, further divulging one of the reasons Curtin had spared her was because she had falsely informed him she could not remember his address. She agreed to lead the police to Curtin's home on Mettmannerstrasse. When the landlady of the property let Budlik into the room of 71 Mettmannerstrasse, Budlik confirmed to Jennat that this was the address of her assailant. The landlady confirmed to the chief inspector the tenant's name was Peter Curtin. Although Curtin was not at home when Budlik and Jennat searched his property, he spotted the pair in the communal hallway and promptly left. Knowing that his identity was now known to the police and suspecting they may also have connected him to the crimes committed by the vampire of Düsseldorf, Curtin confessed to his wife he had raped Budlik and that because of his previous convictions, he may receive 15 years of penal labor. With his wife's consent, he found lodgings in the Adlerstrasse district of Düsseldorf and did not return to his own home until May 23. Upon returning home, Curtin confessed to his wife he was the vampire of Düsseldorf. He urged his wife to collect the substantial reward offered for his capture. August Curtin contacted the police the following day. In the information provided to detectives, Curtin's wife explained that although she had known her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any murders. She then added that her husband had confessed to her his culpability in the Düsseldorf murders and that he was willing to likewise confess to the police. Furthermore, he was to meet her outside St. Rochus Church later that day. That afternoon, Curtin was arrested at gunpoint. Curtin freely admitted his guilt in all the crimes police had attributed to the vampire of Düsseldorf and further confessed he had committed the unsolved murder of Christine Klein and the attempted murder of Gertrude Franken in 1913. In total, Curtin admitted to 68 crimes, including 9 murders and 31 attempted murders. He made no attempt to excuse his crimes but justified them on the basis of what he saw as the injustices he had endured throughout his life. Nonetheless, he was adamant he had not tortured any of his child victims. Curtin also admitted to both investigators and psychiatrists that the actual sight of his victim's blood was, on many occasions, sufficient to bring him to orgasm and that, on occasion, if he experienced ejaculation in the act of strangling a woman, he would immediately become apologetic to his victim, proclaiming, "That's what love is all about." He further claimed to have drunk the blood from the throat of one victim, from the temple of another, and to have licked the blood from a third victim's hands. In the Hahn murder, he had drunk so much blood from the neck wound that he had vomited. Curtin also admitted to having decapitated a swan in the spring of 1930 in order that he could drink the blood from the animal's neck, achieving ejaculation in the process. As Curtin awaited his trial, then later as he awaited his execution, he was extensively interviewed by Dr. Karl Berg. In these interviews, Curtin stated to Dr. Berg that his primary motive in committing any form of criminal activity was one of sexual pleasure, and that he had begun to associate sexual excitement with violent acts and the sight of blood through indulging in daydreams and masturbation fantasies, particularly when he had been isolated from human contact. The majority of his assaults and murders had been committed when his wife had been working evenings, and the number of stab or bludgeoning wounds Curtin inflicted upon each victim had varied depending upon the length of time it had taken him to achieve an orgasm. Furthermore, the actual sight of his victim's blood had been integral to his sexual stimulation. Curtin further elaborated to Dr. Berg that once he had committed an attack or murder, the feeling of tension he experienced before the commission of the crime would be superseded by one of relief. In reference to the actual choice of weapon used in his attacks, Curtin stressed that although he had changed his method of attack to deceive investigators into believing they were seeking more than one perpetrator, the weapon he used was inconsequential in reference to his ultimate objective of seeing his victim's blood. Elaborating, Curtin stated, "Whether I took a knife or a pair of scissors or a hammer in order to see blood was a matter of indifference to me or mere chance. Often after the hammer blows, the bleeding victims moved and struggled, just as they did when they were throttled." Curtin further confided that although he had occasionally penetrated his female victims, he had only done so to feign the act of coitus as a motive for his crimes. He also confessed that many of his later strangulation victims had only survived his attacks because he had achieved an orgasm in the early throes of the assault. However, Curtin contradicted these claims by proclaiming to both Dr. Berg and legal examiners that his primary motive in all his criminal activities was to strike back at an oppressive society for what he considered the injustice of his being repeatedly incarcerated throughout his life, and as a form of revenge for the neglect and abuse he had endured as a child. These desires had fomented in his mind throughout the long periods he had been in solitary confinement for various forms of insubordination, and Curtin explained that he deliberately broke minor prison rules as a means of guaranteeing that he would be sentenced to solitary confinement to indulge in these psychosexual fantasies. To Dr. Berg and the legal examiners, Curtin did not deny that he had sexually molested his female victims or to have stroked or digitally penetrated their genitals as he stabbed, slashed, strangled, or bludgeoned their bodies, although throughout his trial, Curtin consistently claimed the sexual assault of his victims was not his primary motive. Both Berg and other psychologists concluded Curtin was not insane, was fully able to control his actions, and appreciated the criminality of his conduct. Each ruled Curtin was legally sane and competent to stand trial. On April 13, 1931, Peter Curtin stood trial in Düsseldorf, charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 of attempted murder. The proceedings took place before presiding judge Dr. Rose. Curtin pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the charges. Aside from when delivering testimony, Curtin spent the trial surrounded by a heavily guarded shoulder-high iron cage constructed to protect him from potential attacks by the enraged relatives of his victims, and his feet were shackled whenever he was inside this cage. The prosecution initiated the trial by formally reciting each of the charges against Curtin, including the formal confession he had provided to the police following his arrest. When asked by the presiding judge to describe why he had continued to commit acts of arson throughout 1929 and 1930, Curtin explained, "When my desire for injuring people awoke, the love of setting fire to things awoke as well. The sight of the flames excited me, but above all, it was the excitement of the attempts to extinguish the fire and the agitation of those who saw their property being destroyed." Initially claiming that his confession was made to allow his wife to recoup the reward money offered for the capture of the Düsseldorf vampire, Curtin later instructed his defense attorney to change his plea to guilty. Addressing the court, he proclaimed, "I have no remorse. As to whether the recollection of my deeds makes me feel ashamed, I will tell you that, thinking back to all the details is not at all unpleasant. I rather enjoy it." Further pressed on whether he possessed a conscience, Curtin stated he did not. However, when questioned about his motivation for confessing, he reiterated his fondness for his wife and the desire to secure a carefree old age for her. To counteract Curtin's insanity defense, the prosecution introduced 5 eminent doctors and psychiatrists in Germany to testify at the trial. Each testified that Curtin was legally sane and had been fully in control of his actions and impulses at all times. Professor Francioli testified that Curtin's actual motivation in his crimes was the desire for sexual gratification through acts of brutality and violence. Dr. Carl Berg testified that Curtin's motive in committing murder and attempted murder was 90% sadism and 10% revenge related to his perceived sense of injustice. Dr. Berg concluded that Curtin was not a necrophiliac, despite his admission to certain acts. Proof of Curtin's awareness was highlighted by the premeditated nature of his crimes, his ability to abandon an attack if he sensed a risk of being disturbed, and his acute memory of both his crimes and their chronological detail. The deaths of 2 boys, whom Curtin had confessed to drowning at the age of 9, were also disclosed during the trial. The prosecution suggested these deaths indicated a homicidal propensity dating much earlier than 1913. However, medical witnesses disputed this view, stating that, for a child, the death of a friend could be seen as nothing more than an inconsequential passing. During cross-examination, Curtin's defense attorney, Dr. Alex Weiner, challenged the expert's conclusions, arguing that the range of perversions his client had engaged in was tantamount to insanity. However, each doctor and psychiatrist remained adamant about Curtin being legally sane and responsible for his actions. In an attempt to discredit the charges, Weiner questioned whether the occasional physical inaccuracies of the crimes described in Curtin's confession equated to fabrication. Dr. Berg conceded that sections of Curtin's confessions were false but argued that the knowledge he possessed of the murder scenes and the wounds inflicted upon the victims left no doubt as to his guilt. The minor embellishments in his confessions were attributed to Curtin's narcissistic personality. The trial concluded after 10 days, and on April 22, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering their verdict. Curtin was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts of murder, along with 7 counts of attempted murder. Displaying no emotion during the sentencing, Curtin acknowledged the ghastliness of his crimes in his final address to the court, expressing a lack of desire to make excuses for them. Although Curtin did not appeal his conviction, he submitted a plea for pardon to the Minister of Justice, a known opponent of capital punishment, which was officially rejected on July 1. Upon receiving this news, Curtin requested to see his confessor, write letters of apology to the victims' relatives, and bid a final farewell to his wife, all of which were granted. On the evening of July 1, 1931, Curtin enjoyed his last meal, consisting of Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes. After finishing the meal, he requested and received a second helping. At 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2, Curtin faced the guillotine in the grounds of Klingelputz prison, Cologne. Accompanied by the prison psychiatrist and a priest, he walked unassisted to the guillotine. Just before his beheading, Curtin turned to the prison psychiatrist with an unusual question about whether he would hear the sound of his own blood gushing after his head was chopped off. When asked for any last words, Curtin simply smiled and replied, "No." Following his execution, Curtin's head was bisected and mummified, and his brain underwent forensic analysis, revealing no abnormalities. The autopsy showed no significant physical abnormalities, except for an enlarged thymus gland. The interviews conducted by Dr. Carl Berg in 1930 and 1931 marked the first psychological study on a sexual serial killer and served as the foundation for Berg's book, The Sadist. Post-World War II, Curtin's head was transported to the United States and is presently displayed at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin.